In the spirit of reconciliation, Law Squared acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today.
Hi, and welcome to Navigating the ESG Regulatory Landscape, Legal Insights for In-House Teams, presented by Law Squared. I'm your host, commercial lawyer Grace Beaumont, and today we're excited to bring you a global perspective on the issue of ESG, the evolving regulatory framework governing this space, and how legal can take a leadership role in helping the business achieve compliance, and possibly even competitive advantage. Today's session is intended to share real-life experiences, practical learnings, and knowledge on this quickly evolving topic. I'm excited to be joined by two very special guests, both of whom bring real-world experience in this space, both here and in the UK. First up, Cate Bennett, who is the Global General Counsel and Company Secretary at Movember, a leading charity changing the face of men's health across the globe, with a focus on three of the biggest health issues affecting men today: mental health and suicide, prostate cancer, and testicular cancer. As a member of Movember's executive leadership team, Cate oversees Movember's legal, governance, risk, privacy and compliance operations across more than 20 countries and in support of over 1,300 health initiatives worldwide. In her role, Cate draws upon extensive experience in a variety of legal and commercial leadership roles across both the public and not-for-profit sectors. Cate is the Stanford Australia Foundation's Not-for-Profit Leadership Scholarship winner for 2024 and has previously been named Not-for-Profit Lawyer of the Year by the Associate of Corporate Counsel Australia in both 2020 and 2022. Great to have you with us, Cate.
Thanks, Grace.
I'm also pleased to be joined by my Law Squared London colleague, corporate and commercial lawyer Zoe Mortimer. Zoe's background is within both corporate and commercial law, as well as banking and finance law, applied against the understanding of every organisation's most important asset, its people. Before joining the Law Squared UK team, Zoe's work focused on the equity, diversity and inclusion, EDI, sector, something that she's very passionate about. Zoe is previously head of culture and ESG at a people intelligence company where she led culture reviews and was a lead trainer on all EDI-related matters. As the head of culture and ESG, Zoe also led investigations into allegations of racism and sexual harassment in UK-based institutions. Zoe has also acted as sole legal counsel at an empowerment organisation where she worked with young adults from predominantly lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and prior to moving into the EDI sector, Zoe worked as a lawyer in banking and capital markets in the financial services sector, acting for banks on a number of regulatory changes impacting their financial contracts. Outside of work, Zoe is a competitive swimmer currently training for the Masters Olympics. Thanks so much for joining us, Zoe.
Hiya.
So let's start with, what is ESG? I'm sure everyone will be aware that ESG stands for Environment, Social and Governance. But before we go any further, I'd like to unpack the definition itself. As we said, it stands for Environmental, Social and Governance, but in just about every discussion on this topic, the focus seems to be on the environmental limb. Cate, Zoe, can we start with the elephant in the room? What's being missed in this discussion? What do you see as the broader, perhaps less spoken about areas that ESG encompasses? I'll throw to you first, Cate.
I think you're right. I think most people are across the environmental side of it, but the two arms of the social and governance sides probably less spoken about. I think as lawyers, that governance side feels reasonably well understood. So the systems and processes we have in an organisation to make sure that we do what we say we'll do and we do the right thing. So that means compliance, risk management, making sure that you've got leadership development, those sorts of things. The social side can be a little bit trickier to define. In my experience, it is things like making sure that you've got diversity, equity and inclusion embedded in your recruitment processes and your staff retention and labour management or workforce management processes. It's maybe making sure that the products and services you offer are inclusive and serve diverse audiences as well. And then it's the things like the impact of, I guess, your operations on the community that you're a part of. Preferably, organisations will operate in a way that doesn't just take the environment that they've kind of joined, but improves it along the way in what they're doing.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Zoe, did you have anything to add on that one?
Not really. I think Kate's touched on it. I think there's an element of, I think with the social element, it's difficult for organisations to compete between the external culture and the things going on externally versus their internal culture, and how's that balanced, especially from as Cate was saying, a processes and governance perspective. And then obviously you do have the governance piece, which is ultimately a little bit superfluous to requirements in the sense of the fact that it runs through everything anyway. And you kind of have to have a handle on that before you can get a handle on the social side of things and the environmental side of things. And I think the other thing is the environmental side of things is a lot easier to track than the social side of things. It's much easier to put markers in your budgets and your strategy as to what you're going to hit versus your social. So yeah, I don't have much more to add from Cate there, but that's my bit.
Thank you. I think that will definitely assist us in opening up our discussion today, so we can touch on some of those less familiar aspects of ESG. To get us going, Zoe, can I get you to share any reflections you've got on ESG's importance in the UK and its evolution as a source of competitive advantage, as well as any compliance measures? It's been on a longer journey there than here in Australia.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the important thing to note, so the UK's journey with ESG is longer than Australia. I know that Australia is sort of coming into it now. But it was mainly financial services that started to put things into place from a regulatory perspective. And that was mainly from the E side of ESG, in terms of tracking performance in relation to the environmental goals, in terms of investment and suppliers. So it was a lot easier. So it was almost seen as a good thing in the UK at the time that these things were starting to be tracked. But as we'll probably talk about a bit later on, in terms of greenwashing, we have problems with that, in terms of making sure that people aren't putting in environmental goals as part of their strategy, or in terms of trying to get sort of more investment, that they're just not doing it for investment purposes. But that's a difficult thing to track. You can't force intention. So at the moment, things have changed in the UK quite significantly from a political perspective, and in terms of where strategy is set from a political level. ESG kind of taken a pause at the minute, I would say, in the UK. We're looking to reevaluate how we can more meaningfully track ESG goals within organisations. So yeah, that's where the UK is at the minute. Where that actually lands is actually yet to be seen. It would be interesting, especially from the S side of the ESG framework, where we kind of get a competitive advantage. It'd be intriguing to see how that happens.
And do you see the UK as being at the forefront of kind of leading the ESG challenge, or are there other geographies that you think might be further ahead, say Europe, the US?
So I think in terms of being ahead, I think so Europe is a good example, except for the fact that so Europe's been ahead in terms of, if you're taking ESG, the E side of things and the S side of things. Let's take France, for example. Certain religious discussions, for example, are banned in France in the workplace. From a social perspective, it's a lot stricter in terms of how diversity and inclusion is monitored. Saying that, they lead better from an E perspective, because governments tend to lead more strongly from an environmental perspective, and they come out with a much stronger line in terms of what they intend to do from an environmental perspective. So yes, Europe may be doing better, but again, as we'll talk about a bit later, like, could it be seen as greenwashing? Is it just token? It's not as clear cut as we think it is here. But we definitely, from a regulatory perspective, showed the way of how, you can do it, but how meaningful that is a different matter, I would say. Something that Australia might, do well in.
Remains to be seen.
Yeah.
The commentary out there says that sort of the main drivers of ESG are the economic benefits, and that's how ESG practices contribute to long-term financial performance, stakeholder expectations, given that there's an increasing demand from investors, customers, and employees now, and as well as the reputation piece, where the impact of ESG on corporate reputation and customer loyalty really kind of comes into play. Do you think, I guess, both in the UK and in Australia, those are probably accurate, or do you see any other kind of drivers that are emerging?
Well, I think actually Cate would happy to touch on this one, but also Cate, from a perspective of being at Movember, you touching on the perception of organisations. So I think there's a lot of the regulatory framework and the changes that have happened in relation to ESG are pinpointing large organizations with big financial turnover. However, it's a lot of the smaller organizations, the startups, the kind of grassroots organizations that really try to tackle ESG, which, if you think about, you've got a company of 5 people, it's a lot easier to hit your ESG goals, but is it practical for them to do so in terms of setting up a business? But it's the grassroots companies that are interested in and keen to partner with and be funded by ethical companies that have ESG responsibilities. Cate, I don't know if you're seeing something similar with Movember, but I can imagine that you are.
Yeah, I think you're right, Zoe. I think often regulations follow social trends because, regulations are made by governments, and governments are here to serve communities. But often those things are started by smaller organisations who maybe have a bit more freedom, or maybe are a little bit more authentic in what they want to do. So you might have a small organisation that's 5 or 10 people as a startup, but they might be really progressive in what they're doing in terms of environmental goals, because their customer base or their ambition to serve a particular community is around doing whatever it is that they do. Maybe they produce products and they do it in a sustainable way. And so I think those things take trends, and bigger organisations start to follow suit because their customers or constituents demand that.
Sorry, did you have anything to add there, Zoe?
No, I was just agreeing with Cate. And I think that's the driver. That's the main driver for ESG, especially for, if you taking again Movember as an example, is global, but it's not a global bank. It's global, but it's not a global bank. People, in terms of, if people are going to give to Movember, they're going to look into, what does Movember do for its own people? What does Movember do for the environment? Less so for a global bank. They're different parties that are looking into the ESG landscape for either company.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I guess it's sort of in the same vein. But how do those drivers look, Cate, in the not-for-profit context, and I guess your sort of ESG challenges as a whole for Movember? How does that kind of differ from the private sector?
I think Zoe's kind of spot on in terms of what our purpose is. So we have a purpose around men's health, but we're also a movement that is driven by supporters, and our supporters have expectations about how we use the donated time and effort, and how we create impact with that. And where maybe 20 years ago, people were less concerned about those kind of ESG elements and sort of went, well, I've given $10 to men's health and I expect at best $9 to go to men's health. Those expectations about dollars and impact haven't changed, but there are also almost social contracts that we have to say that we're here to better the community, and that is more complex than perhaps we used to appreciate. So yeah, I'm going to start with the G side of things because it's probably a little bit closer to my wheelhouse. But my team and I we oversee and manage a really mature governance framework at Movember. And what that does is it helps people to see that we do have all of those things that you would expect: risk management frameworks, we have business continuity plans, we look at modern slavery and compliance, and we make sure that we're operating in line with those minimum legal requirements, but also with best practice in mind. We think about the way that we impact the environment in terms of what we do. So, as you expect, most households that I know of and most businesses, we start to make choices about green procurement as far as we can. And when we talk about the social side of things, we absolutely have a responsibility to safeguard our employees and vulnerable donors and fundraisers as well. When we start to work with youth, we think about how we safeguard children and the specific risks that come with that. And then perhaps closer to our kind of core purpose, we do a lot of work in men's health, but we also deliberately sort of set out to make sure that the benefits that we're trying to deliver across the health system and to consumers is inclusive. So we look at how do we make sure that progress in cancer treatments is available to underserved communities, or even just people in different countries working with different systems that may or may not support them the same way that we are used to, say, here in Australia where we're headquartered. So I think ESG kind of creeps into everything that an organisation does, but from a charitable perspective, we really have to look at what's our purpose and how do we do things in a way that is both responsible and inclusive and respectful and meets the expectations of those that support us.
So Movember is, as you've said, ostensibly a men's health organisation. So do you find that it is difficult to balance, meeting those other elements of ESG whilst remaining true to your core purpose? And I suppose more specifically, what is legal's role in that decision-making process? Because obviously your role is a little bit more broad than a conventional GC.
Yeah, for sure. Look, I think we sort of just talked about having the same sort of social mandates as for-profit entities, and I don't think that's super controversial, but Zoe might challenge me on that. But I think in the NFP space, there's this really healthy tension about prioritising doing good generally and making sure that you're prioritising the investment of your dollars and effort into doing good that's aligned with your core purpose. And so, we will promote land rehabilitation and environmental issues in the concept of well-being being aligned with health in Indigenous and First Nations communities. And we'll look at land-based programming where that makes sense. Will we maybe set up our own version of a Clean Up Australia Day? Probably not, because it's too far from our core purpose. And so I think that tension is a good thing for us to grapple with all the time, but we don't perhaps have the same freedom that maybe a bank does, although arguably they don't because they're answerable to their shareholders as well, to say, oh, what we're going to do is, buy top shelf products in every category because they're presumably greener than what's available at more reasonable pricing, for example. In terms of legal's role, I think in-house legal teams have this really unique breadth of oversight over often an organisation's entire sort of set of activities and operations. And so I think where great in-house legal teams can operate is being real business partners and building that trust and that voice with your internal clients and the teams that you work with to be able to say, hey, I've noticed that we're doing these 5 different things 5 different ways, but maybe there's an opportunity for us to look at that issue and figure out how we might do it in a way that is perhaps more environmentally friendly or more inclusive or thinks about our diversity or governance requirements in a different way. And I don't think a legal team or any team in an organisation can be the ESG guy. So you can't say, hey, Jim, you're our ESG manager. That's never going to work. But if you're a team that has a really well-respected voice and that you've got good awareness of what's happening, it gives you an ability to have a really meaningful impact on your organisation's kind of ESG activities and impact.
Yeah, great. Sticking with you, Cate, can I ask how you at Movember measure and report on your progress in terms of your ESG goals?
Yeah, there's lots of different ways. I don't know of any organisation that sort of just has a single ESG report. That's probably a bit weird. But when you think about all the different mechanisms and reports we all have to grapple with in kind of corporate life, there's always an ESG element to it. So again, I'll go to governance because it feels a bit closer to my comfortable space. But we do risk management reporting, we do compliance reporting and board effectiveness frameworks we've got in place, things like that. And all of those different types of reports have indicators that'll give you an idea of how well we might be doing in that space. We look at complaints trends, staff turnover, recruitment, and then our programs always have strategic and activity-based goals and KPIs aligned to them, many of which have a mandate around diversity and inclusion. So we'll have programs that say we want to achieve X improvement in a particular system, but we've also put funding towards doing that in the context of this particular community or cohort of people, because we know that otherwise they won't be necessarily served equitably. And so I think if you look at ESG in terms of it affecting and being impacted by an organisation's entire set of operations, it's pretty easy to see metrics kind of in all of the places that you'll report across your day-to-day and your year-to-year.
Do you find that there are any differences in the way you sort of approach that based on geography? So say, is your reporting different here than what it would be in the UK, or do you kind of take a broad brush approach?
We try to be pretty consistent at Movember, and I think that comes with the luck of being reasonably mature. So again, it's a bit like the way that we would deal with privacy. There's all of these different regulations that you have to comply with in the world of privacy, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but we try and find the high watermark. So if there's government or regulatory mandated reporting mechanisms, we'll obviously meet them, but then we'll try and embed those requirements into our day-to-day or period-to-period reporting to make sure that we're sort of reporting and comparing apples and apples over time.
Sure, yeah. Makes sense. Zoe, I'm just going to bring you back in. We've spoken a bit about what can get lost in, I guess, the definition of ESG. Mm. So with that broader picture in mind, what are some of the big challenges you see for delivering on ESG?
Good question. So I think the biggest thing with ESG is something that Cate's touched on. I think especially for not-for-profits. So you have the external opinion of what the not-for-profit should be doing. So often with not-for-profits, it's, there for the greater good. It's there for a community of people that are in need of help. And therefore, everything that comes out of that organisation should be for the good. And then there's this idea that everything should be resolved within that not-for-profit. So it should be fully diverse. It should have fully, working. They should be hitting their kind of net zero targets by 2010 kind of thing. Like, why haven't you done it? So there's this competing, there's the external pressures and the external perceptions for not-for-profits, for example, versus the realities of not working in a not-for-profit. So if, let's take working in Australia, what's the likelihood of being able to be fully diverse in a way that, say, somebody in the UK or somebody in America might classify as diverse versus the community and the nature of the people in Australia? It's not easy to hit, and therefore there's this constant need for having to validate or excuse certain, like, why are people predominantly of a Caucasian nature? Well, it's because we're based predominantly in Australia. That's why. And having to constantly explain yourself. So that's a big challenge. And then you, as we've talked about, using banks as an example, they're sort of coming under fire. But equally, there's the, big organizations that are able to set out big goals, and it's only really the investors and the shareholders that will be pulling them up against it, because in terms of what you want for a bank, I mean, people are turning towards more ethical banking, but but generally people just go with a bank and don't really consider it. So the challenges are how you're perceived in the market as to how we've seen not-for-profits, we've seen companies be written off, be cancelled for not applying their ESG goals or not hitting their ESG goals, whether that's the E side, the S side. And I think that's really difficult. And as Cate was saying, in terms of what you tackle in the ESG space in your organization, it's so broad brush, and you could end up doing it forever, because it's a bit like thinking about who do you give to charity, right? Like there's so many different organizations in the world that do such great work, and it's like you have a limited amount of money from your paycheck and you're like, well, I don't know where to put my money. It's a similar principle with ESG. It's like, well, where do I start? What are the issues that we can do? And then, as Cate was saying, aligning it back to, well, it's not really aligned with our purpose, and then but having to almost explain that to the public is very, very difficult. So I would say that's a huge challenge for ESG.
Sure, yeah.
In companies.
Cate, do you have anything to add to that?
No, but I love that. I think we see it in that increasing landscape with cybersecurity breaches as well. You could put endless amounts of money into investing in your security posture, but it's not necessarily going to be the full answer. And so for me, I love what you were saying, Zoe, about that authenticity of what you tackle and thinking about where can you have the most impact, because ultimately I think that's what organisations probably have to do, commit to the things that they're able to do well, and then maybe set aspirational targets about where they'll move to going forward, and keep building on that.
That's very insightful. Thank you. So as we've said, consumers are one of the main drivers of ESG, especially lately. We've seen that they're expecting greater ESG commitments, and the government and regulatory frameworks have not caught up within Australia. Zoe, could you give us a bit of background as to what the existing regulations and reporting frameworks are currently in the UK?
Oh, that's a good question. So, like I said, it was mainly financial services that kind of brought out the regulatory frameworks in the UK. So that, in one sense, it does stem and does touch across a number of different types of organisations. But currently, because of greenwashing in particular, there's been a call to regroup on ESG in the UK as to how it can be more meaningfully achieved, especially for, as we were talking about, talking about grassroots versus huge banks. It's, they're not apples. They're not like for like. It's not apples for apples in that sense. So how can it be more meaningfully aligned, and also aligned with what's happening in the rest of the world? And also I don't know if you've seen it, but there's been a kind of trend of big organizations are greenwashing, and then there's been the kind of the counterpiece to that, which is, have they really been greenwashing? Have you hit a target? Did you say that you were going to achieve X, Y, and Z? Cate, you brought up a really good example when we spoke last year about Coca-Cola. And I thought that was a really great example of, in reality, the headline was great. Coca-Cola's been greenwashing and they're not plastic free. But when you look into what they actually said they were, they never said that in the first place. But I think people want to... I think at the moment we're in a state globally where things aren't great and people want something to change. They're just not sure how that change should look. So it's kind of easy, are we really is Coca-Cola the be all and end all of all our ESG problems? No, it's not. It's really not. So the regulatory landscape has to kind of regroup, because it's a bit like if we take the social side of things, 2020, the death of George Floyd, there was a big drive for changes in diversity, equity, inclusion within within organizations, but not just organizations, globally. what that actually looks like in practice is very, very different to the ideal of it being a fair and just world. It's not that easy to tackle. So how do you regroup? It's a bit like using your, strategy for your company. Yes, you've got your huge goals that you might be able to tackle in the next 20, what you'd like to be in 20 years, but what are the small things you can tackle now that actually make steps towards that change? And that's what's, I hope, is happening in the UK in terms of relooking at the ESG landscape here.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it's all smooth sailing. Much like Australia, as you would know, Cate, in particular. Over here, it's, I guess, for lack of a better term, it's fragmented. We have our ESG obligations and regulations spread across, I don't even know how many different acts. Modern Slavery Act, Workplace Health and Safety legislation, environmental laws, Corporations Act. It's sort of here, there, and everywhere. So I'm not sure that this will happen, but do you see there being a move towards a harmonisation of international ESG standards? Zoe, first, please.
I don't know about you, Cate, but I'm not really sure how, because I'm going to take the social side of things. Actually, take the E and the S from ESG. Everybody has you have different competing needs from a different country. So in terms of environmental, social, let's take Australia versus the UK, for example. Australia tends to be more homogenous, save for the fact that there's the Aboriginals in Australia versus we don't have that in the UK, but we have a much more diverse and multicultural community within the UK from many different backgrounds. They're not like for like. So I don't really see how you could harmonize ESG or standardize ESG across the world. If you were a company in Brazil, you've got much higher, your E from the ESG is most likely to be a lot higher in terms of preserving the environment. And what does your social look like? Again, the community is entirely different. The culture is entirely different. And I don't think you can harmonize that. And I think that's probably one of the most difficult things about ESG is that it's just the reason it's fragmented in different legislation is because it can't be to put it into one rule, into one legislation would be incredibly difficult and really, really hard for people to actually achieve anything within the company. It would make in-house legal counsel's job incredibly difficult.
I think you're right, Zoe. I think I'd probably challenge you on some of it, but I think you're right in terms of the detail of it. We're never going to have homogenous regulation of anything across the world. It just doesn't work like that. But if you think about the principles behind some of that regulation, there probably is some commonality there. So while we say the S aspect might be completely different between the US and, say, Brazil or Australia, UK, Europe, wherever you want to look, sure. But I think communities are demanding similar principles or values from organisations. So you could start with the basics of people will be paid living wages, and organisations of all sorts should be on the hook for doing that and making sure they've got systems and processes in place to make sure that anyone who's working full-time can actually afford to live off those funds. I think if you look at the environment, increasingly we're seeing large parts of the world align on the fact that maybe targets for carbon reduction aren't the same or the methodology to get there isn't the same. But first world countries certainly all appreciate the need to address climate change and look at the ways that we impact the environment and how we can reduce that as a whole. And so the mechanisms for getting there and the regulation are always going to be different, and they're always going to have to be sensitive to individual jurisdictions and communities. But I think as a global community, we're probably getting a little bit more aligned in terms of what we expect of each other and how we should get there. The challenge is some companies and organisations are going to have a easier ability to stretch and flex than others. So how do we support each other to do that, rather than go down that route that that Zoe, you were sort of talking about in terms of cynicism, where there are a lot of things going on in the world, whether it's ESG related or not. I think we as humans have this tendency to look for problems, not solutions. So how do we change a conversation from being Coca-Cola, you're greenwashing, or Disney, you're bluewashing, to, hey, Disney, you're trying to reflect more diverse communities and more diverse stories in the content that you're making, and that's a really good thing. And sure, it might not be perfect yet, but the ambition is good. And the same with Coca-Cola. You know, you can't look at them and say, oh, they use recycled materials and that offsets the entire impact they have on the environment. But maybe we flip that conversation to say, but it's a good thing that they're at least trying to do something and thinking about what they can do and how they get there in the future.
Yeah, kind of bring in that progress over perfection
I
approach.
agree, but also it's 2023, right? So people, I think we, like, looking at the global community and just the general consumer of any product wants to see perfection, right? They want to see changes. And that's the difficulty, because I think intention versus impact is really important. I think especially in the DEI space, in terms of intention, you can intend something from the best place and the impact can still be the same. So how do lawmakers, how do legislators capture something that's different for each organization? So, for example, let's use Coca-Cola versus a really small company that's, a small beer company, for example, who's like, yeah, actually, we're going to do things green. They're not like for like. So how do we measure, how would they be measuring the progress that those companies are making without Coca-Cola ending up on the front page or the small beer company ending up on the front page for not hitting their targets, or because it isn't the same. So it's down to each relationship. And then we go back to procurement, in-house legal, who are, partnerships teams who are responsible for that. That's a lot of pressure on them to be able to monitor those things. Not saying that it can't be done, but I think that's where we're at with ESG at the minute.
You're right, Zoe. I think it's incredibly complex, isn't it? It's too easy to say, hey, we can fix this if we all just pull in one direction.
Yeah, but like you said, there has to be a way around it. We can't just be sat here in another 10 years talking about ESG. We have to have moved on from it somehow.
That's actually a really good segue. Because as of 1 July this year in Australia, businesses with over 500 employees, a revenue of over 500 million, and assets in over 1 billion are going to be required to report on monitoring of climate-related risks and opportunities, the potential impact of climate-related risks to its business and the business's ability to withstand the impacts of climate change going forward, the process the business is using to identify and manage risks and opportunities related to climate change, and climate-related metrics, including scope 1 to 3 greenhouse emissions and the business's progress towards any targets that it has set for itself. It sounds to me that the trickiest part for businesses to navigate is going to be the disclosure of scope 3 emissions, as those are the emissions that the organisation influences rather than directly controls. And so that's going to include emissions that come from the organisation's supply chain. It's expected that the changes will be rolled out to smaller organisations over the next few years, obviously, as I said, starting with the larger ones come July 1. Cate, I'm going to throw this one to you. How do you see those changes impacting what's required of businesses and their ESG strategies?
Gosh, I think they're tricky. They're really good changes. I must admit I'm pretty grateful that Movember won't be captured, because we're a little bit too small, and so we'll be really looking at what other people do and how they comply with them. I think the good thing about capturing bigger organisations is, sure, they have a bigger impact on environment, but hopefully they also have better access to the resources and maturity of advisors to look at tackling that. Because if I sit here today, I'm honestly not sure exactly how I would tackle that from a Movember point of view. We do look at being mindful of the kind of supply chain that we use, And I think organisations have gotten used to that over a period of time, with things like modern slavery coming in as well. But that doesn't mean that we necessarily capture data that covers all of those metrics or all of the impacts that we influence, as well as the ones that we control. And when I think about our organisation, things like taking international flights, I just can't quite begin to imagine how we would track all of that consistently and accurately and frankly meaningfully. But I like the idea of it. So that was a bit of a non-answer, but I think my fundamental answer is I'll be watching bigger businesses to see how they do it.
Yeah, and I think the interesting part there is, especially to do with those emissions, while they may not be essentially requiring these smaller organizations to report, these smaller organizations are still going to be required by these bigger organizations that they're working with to track those things. So they're essentially covered by association at this point. So it'll be interesting to see how it comes out in the wash, I think. So increased disclosure on ESG is a certainty, and it's something that legal teams absolutely have a role to play, especially in ensuring compliance. Cate, what do you see as the biggest challenges in complying with mandatory reporting? And I guess, do you have any advice? Just to throw you under the bus a little bit.
Ooh, advice? I'm a little bit trepidatious to share, but I think for me, the role that my team and I try and play at Movember is to be really strong business partners. We're not the experts on a whole range of things that we have in terms of our compliance, but what we can do is work through compliance requirements, reporting requirements, and sit down with some of our subject matter experts who maybe aren't as great with navigating reporting frameworks or paperwork generally. And then really putting the logic test on things. So lawyers are always really good analytical thinkers, and we're really good at communicating, or you hope that you're good at communicating. And so I think the role that my team can and will keep playing is helping those in our organisation who are tracking things like social KPIs around recruitment, diversity, inclusion, environmental impact, as well as the things that we do manage and oversee ourselves around governance, to figure out what's the best way for us to articulate what we're doing, what do we need to do, and how do we embed that effectively within our day-to-day processes. I think the other piece is that lawyers are just really good at keeping their fingers on the pulse and looking for change in particularly regulation. And I think really great legal teams don't just look for changes, but they look for the trends that are influencing them and stay ahead of them. And so certainly my team and I will keep kind of watching the news and keeping our ears and eyes open to see what people are saying and what commentary is out there from industry groups and community generally.
I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to do a bit of a topic switch here. I'd like to chat about greenwashing. I want to address this specifically as it's hit the headlines repeatedly in the last couple of years. But just so everyone listening is aware, greenwashing is essentially the practice of making false or misleading claims about the environmental sustainability of a product or process. And that may be claiming a product is green based on a narrow set of attributes rather than looking at its larger environmental impact, selectively picking the data that you receive to frame your product or processes in a better light, or as we sort of touched on, failing to account for the business practices of organisations within a company's supply chain, which may impact those sustainability claims. The ACCC has identified greenwashing as one of its enforcement priorities, which leads me to my next question. I'm going to throw this one to you, Zoe. How do you see greenwashing impacting on corporate trust, and what's the reputational risk of getting it wrong?
It's a good question. I think if we take Coca-Cola as a perfect example, not much. It's going to take a lot to take Coca-Cola down in that respect. It's huge. I think in terms of where greenwashing is a potential flag is for not-for-profits, because like we said earlier, there's the public opinion of what not-for-profits should be doing, and whether or not they are interested in understanding the purpose of the charity and the competing needs of that charity or not-for-profit organisation. there's an assumption that not-for-profits are wholly good. And I think it's going to be, greenwashing would be more of a problem for not-for-profits and smaller organisations who rely on suppliers, investors, shareholders for their business. And whether that, I mean, any reputational damage for small to medium enterprises and not-for-profits is always going to be a problem, whether it's greenwashing, whether it's saying they're going to have 50% of women on the board by 2050 or whatever, and they don't have it, those kind of things, same. So I actually think it's more of a challenge for those companies than it will ever be for much larger organisations. They've also got the money to be able to kind of head off publicity and things like that, whereas smaller organisations maybe don't.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I do think that we should touch on bluewashing as well. So Zoe, could you just give us a brief explanation as to what this is, please?
Well, I actually think Cate should touch on what bluewashing is, because I don't want to get it wrong.
Happy for Cate to give the definition.
Yeah.
I'll take that challenge. Look,
go for it.
Bluewashing, similar to greenwashing, it's really, from my perspective, it's about overstating claims about social responsibility and those aspects of what people do. So saying, we cherry pick figures on how beneficial this service or product is for a particular marginalised community. It's not dissimilar in some ways to rainbow washing. It's over-egging your impact or selectively choosing your narrative. And I think there are a couple of reasons why that happens. So we've all seen clumsy versions of whether it's greenwashing, bluewashing, or rainbow washing, the ones that are really obvious to spot. And it's generally, I'm hesitant to say it, but I think it's often bad marketing or bad advice on what your PR should say. But then there's the complexity to it where I think sometimes people do things with great intention and perhaps they don't explain or articulate themselves very well. And so Zoe touched on Coca-Cola as an example of, well, what happens with regulators in those instances. That's really tricky, right? Because you've got regulators who fundamentally, in my view, should be promoting compliance with standards and doing the right thing. And so do they spend time going after organisations that have maybe just tried and not picked up the nuance? Or do they spend their time and money on educating people on how to make sure that the claims that they're making are veracious? I don't know in the long term, but I feel really lucky to be part of Movember because we're an organisation that's quite authentic, and one of our explicit values is being straight talking. And so we tend to not be caught by those sorts of issues because we're often willing to tell the whole story. In fact, we're always willing to tell the whole story. So we'll say things like we're looking to have an impact on mental health or suicide prevention. We're not going to solve it all on our own, and we're not going to tell you that we are. I think that's part of our DNA as an organisation, but there'd be a bunch of commercial organisations and NFPs that will really struggle with the concept of not meeting the bar that's always pointed out a few times, that some people expect not-for-profits in particular to be wholly good in every aspect of everything they do, and it's just not realistic.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair enough. So just with that in mind, I suppose, what would you say are some tips for in-house teams that they can implement to help their business avoid greenwashing?
I think it's having those really hard conversations. I think it always comes down to me about being really good business partners, and sometimes that means not being a yes partner. So it's quite okay to challenge the people you work with as long as you do that in an environment where you've built trust between yourselves and your stakeholders. And so I often have conversations with people to say, hey, I can see that you've noted this in a particular board report, or maybe you've put this in an RFP about what we're doing or not doing. But do you think we should look at the nuance of that? Because it could be read this way or that way. So can we really get to the nub of what are we trying to say? And do we actually need to be a little bit more articulate about where the drawbacks or problems are that underlie whatever topic we're talking about? I think if you're not doing that as a legal team, whilst your clients may really love you because you're always a yes person, you're actually not doing your job and you're not serving them the way that you should be. So it feels like a bit of a non-answer, but authenticity and business partnering is probably the answer to most things that in-house legal teams do.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Completely reasonable. And I guess just to build on that, Zoe, with the changes that are coming in mind, anything you can kind of add to what Kate's just said that will help in-house teams prepare for those changes and the challenges that they're going to bring?
Yeah, I think one, start small, work your way up to the goals that you want to hit as an organization. What are you already currently working on that works well? What do you need to change, and how can you change it? And two, working with everybody else in the organizations. It can't just be on in-house legal to affect these changes or be on top of these changes. In-house legal teams have enough, general counsel has enough in terms of looking after the legal team and the legal risk of the business. So in terms of having people that are invested in the organization that is willing to be a steward of or a captain of an element of ESG for the business. But yeah, definitely start small. And it sounds like a really a simple thing to say, but you're starting small and things that you can easily tick off. So as Cate was saying, sort of in an RFP, like tracing it back to, you've said you're going to do X, Y, and Z, and just being able to put a dotted line to what has been done. And that way, in terms of like, this goes to our values. So you can show exactly why practices or something has taken place because it's in line with the values and the strategy that's been set by the company. Sounds a bit corporate, but if ESG is a regulatory framework, we kind of have to have that corporate box around it or strategy box around it. So yeah, those would be my tips.
Great, thank you. I'm conscious of time, so Cate, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think you've covered a pretty broad conversation, certainly given me a stretch.
That's the aim of the game. Super grateful. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and for joining me today. It's been incredibly eye-opening, and I think that our viewers are really going to kind of get the benefit of what legal's role is in managing the risks and challenges related to ESG, and how we as lawyers generally can help the business and the businesses we work for, our clients, as well as in-house teams, achieve competitive advantage by taking an early approach to managing ESG, whether that's reporting or implementing strategies. For me, what I've jotted down was that, and I guess these are my key takeaways, ESG is an issue that in-house teams need to be on the front foot of. And if the organisation isn't likely to fall into that first tranche, they still need to begin preparing because those changes are going to be quite significant and time-consuming and probably require a fair bit of planning for. Greenwashing in general, it's a hot topic. It can be, on the face of it, easily avoided. But I think when you dive a little bit deeper, as we have today, it gets a little bit more challenging. And as you said, the best of intentions can kind of sometimes go astray. And the third thing is that legal has a role to play in how it can direct its spend and how that can contribute to the ESG goals of the organisation, which I think is really exciting. And thank you very much to all of our viewers. I've seen a number of your questions trickle through. I think we've been able to answer some of those along the way, but I'm looking forward to going through those in more detail and coming back to you with some more detailed answers and resources in the coming days. So once again, Cate, Zoe, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Thanks, and goodbye for now.
Thanks.
Gross.